This is a lecture from Open Tuition. For the free slides that go with this podcast, please visit opentuition.com.
Corporate governance considers how companies are directed and controlled. And the problem arises because the people who own the company, that's the shareholders, are often not in day-to-day contact with the company or what's going on within it. That job has been delegated to the directors. The directors are the agents of the shareholders. They are the stewards, or the people who are looking after the company's assets. But how do the shareholders know that the directors are acting in the shareholders' best interests? Corporate governance is the system by which companies are directed and controlled. Historically, the annual general meeting at which members of the company would meet and vote on certain resolutions was one of the few ways in which this could be accomplished. And at the AGMs they would be presented with audited accounts. However, at least 12 months will go by between each AGM and each set of accounts, and this could leave plenty of scope for things to go wrong. Additionally, the directors were supposed to look after the day-to-day management of the company as a board, all meeting at once. But what often happened was that formal board meetings were rare, and there were lots of individual conversations, say between the chief executive officer and one director, and then another conversation with the second director, and so on, and the board as a whole could perhaps never see what the company was actually doing. The problems and issues with corporate governance came to a head after a number of high-profile and very large corporate failures. Questions were asked about why companies like Enron, WorldCom and more recently Lehman Brothers failed so spectacularly, when everyone had presumed that these companies had been well managed and well governed. The UK Corporate Governance Code can be quoted or used as an example of good practice in corporate governance. Here it states that the purpose of corporate governance is to facilitate effective entrepreneurial and prudent management that can deliver long-term success of the company. Notice that there is a slight tension between entrepreneurial and prudent. It does recognize that good management is not management which completely avoids all risks, because taking risks is inseparable from managing a business. They then have 5 main principles, and you should know what these are: leadership, effectiveness, accountability, remuneration, and relations with shareholders. The Corporate Governance Code has no legal standing. It is not the law. It is something which, however, is enforced by the stock exchange, and all companies listed on the stock exchange are required to comply with the Corporate Governance Code or explain why they haven't. This leaves some flexibility. Very much the Corporate Governance Code is aimed at the spirit of the code rather than very, very specific compliance. If the company can explain why a particular matter has not been exactly complied with, then that should be fine, provided they can convince the shareholders that they've made the right decision. Here's a summary of what the code says about leadership. Every company should be headed by an effective board which is collectively responsible for the long-term success of the company. Very importantly, there should be a clear division between running the board and the executive responsibility for running the company's business. And in practice this means that the roles of the chief executive officer, who runs the company, and the chairman, who is responsible for leadership of the board, these roles should be separate. If they were combined into one person, that person could have too much power. Very importantly, non-executive directors should be appointed. Non-executive directors will sit in on board meetings, have full voting capacity, but they are not responsible for the day-to-day running of the company. The non-executive directors can watch what the executive directors are doing, give advice, and give warning. They fulfill a very important role indeed under the UK Corporate Governance Code. the board is accountable for certain matters. It must be able to present a balanced and understandable assessment of the company's position and prospects. As part of that, it must understand the significant risks and should maintain sound risk management and internal control systems. Note that there is a requirement that the board establishes internal control. The board should establish formal and transparent arrangements for applying corporate reporting, risk management, and internal control principles, and for maintaining an appropriate relationship with the company's auditor. This means that there will be an audit committee to look after relations both with the internal audit department and with external auditors. The board should consider the need for internal audit. Note that they are responsible for internal control, and they must consider the need for internal audit. Of course, directors require remuneration, and this must be high enough to attract and retain good people, but you don't want to pay them more than is actually necessary. Note that this probably means that the remuneration of a director should be roughly in line with what the remuneration of directors in similar companies and similar industries are receiving. Two things to note. A significant proportion of executive directors' remuneration should be structured to link rewards to performance. In other words, some sort of profit-related pay is very much required. You don't want to be paying people for non-performance. Secondly, there will be a remuneration committee. Again, this is composed of non-executive directors, and they will develop a policy for executive remuneration and fixing the remuneration and rewards packages of directors. No director should be involved in deciding his or her own remuneration. Note that we've now had 3 committees. We had a nomination committee to appoint new directors. We had an audit committee to look after relations with both internal and external auditors. And now we have a remuneration committee. All of these committees are run by non-executive directors. Under the heading of effectiveness, the code sets out that the directors must have the appropriate balance of skills, experience, independence and knowledge. And here it specifies how many non-executive directors there should be to get the right balance. In large companies, the non-executive directors should be at least 50% of the board, and in small companies there should be at least 2 non-executive directors. If there were fewer non-executive directors, then they do not have sufficient power to stand up against the executive directors. Secondly, it's very important that new directors are properly appointed, and this implies a formal, rigorous and transparent procedure, just as you would have to undertake if you were appointing another employee. What the code wanted to get away from was appointing friends and people to whom you may owe favours. There should be a nomination committee, and that will be composed of non-executive directors, and the nomination committee looks after the appointment of new directors. Directors must be able to give sufficient time, they should be given training where necessary, and they should be given the proper information where necessary. The board should undertake a formal and rigorous annual evaluation of its own performance and that of the committees. And again, the non-executive directors will be charged with setting out the evaluation of the executive directors. And finally, all directors should be submitted for re-election at regular intervals. What we don't want is a director, once they've got in there, sitting there endlessly. One of the problems with successful corporate governance is that all too often the shareholders, remember they're the owners of the company, take very little interest in what the directors are doing. And indeed the directors may discourage a lot of interest being taken, hoping that they have more or less got a free rein to do what they want. The Corporate Governance Code requires directors to encourage good relations and good communication with shareholders. Otherwise, how can the shareholders properly understand what the board is planning to do, and therefore whether or not it actually has achieved what it planned to do? A good dialogue is required. And in particular, the board should use the AGM. That's where all the shareholders can come and meet. They should use the AGM to communicate with investors and to encourage their participation in the governance of the company.